Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Welcome. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. The union, which represents thousands of striking Canada Post workers, says the Crown Corporation is now using scare tactics. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre explains why he voted against the Trudeau government's GST holiday. And a new study reveals which provinces in Canada are the most dangerous to work in. We have the details.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The union representing around 55,000 striking Canada Postal workers says the Crown Corporation is using a scare tactic by temporarily laying some of them off during the walkout. The company told employees the collective agreements are no longer in effect and their conditions of employment have changed. They refer to the section of the Canada Labour Code that covers lockout notices. Canada Post issued a lockout notice earlier this month, but said it did not intend to lock out employees. Instead, saying the notice would allow the company to make changes to its operations in order to respond to the effects of the strike. The debate among federal party leaders over the GST holiday is taking place Thursday evening in the House of Commons. It would bring some temporary relief to shoppers who buy kids' clothing, toys, and video game consoles, and even Christmas trees between mid-December to mid-February. The holiday also affects restaurants with catered meals, wine, beer, candy, and snacks. The NDP only agreed to support the bill after the Trudeau Liberals separated the GST break from a promise to also send $250 to most working Canadians in the spring because it wants that benefit expanded. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says the GST holiday for 2 months simply cannot fix all of the damage the Trudeau government has done. He said he was going to vote against the Liberals' GST holiday, branding it a trick that is only temporary and not a real tax cut. Poilievre says with Trudeau at the helm, Canada is still broken.
Everything is broken because he is a weak leader who has lost control. He has lost control of spending, which has doubled. The debt has doubled. Housing costs have doubled. Food bank use have doubled. He has done this through a costly carbon tax that's driven up food prices 37% faster in Canada than in the United States of America. We have the worst housing inflation and the worst household debt of any G7 country. $500 billion net has left our country to invest in the United States, creating jobs for American workers with our money. Our GDP per capita is smaller than it was 10 years ago.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, meanwhile, spoke at the Sustainable Finance Forum in Ottawa on Thursday. Trudeau says he knows times are pretty tough for Canadians right now, but the scare tactics for Mr. Poilievre are really wearing thin.
People are anxious. It's understandable. And right now, when people are squeezed every single day at the grocery store, in paying their rents, in thinking about whether their job's going to hold them to retirement, what their kids are going to do, it's really easy to scare people into being even more anxious and thinking even more short-term and more limited. The challenge with that is the pressures we're facing are not going to go away. They're only going to get worse, particularly around climate change, which will worsen every other challenge we're facing, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's economic pressures, whether it's supply chains, whatever it is.
Members of the Trudeau caucus met with provincial premiers where they discussed the threat by U.S. President-elect Donald Trump to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland says they agreed on the need to work in a united way to address that challenge. Ontario Premier Doug Ford released a statement accusing the Trudeau government of being, quote, flat-footed.
We agreed that we need to be smart, strong, and united in meeting this challenge. We spoke principally about the border and the Canada-U.S. trade relationship. I don't want to minimize for a moment the gravity of the challenge we now face. But I also think it is important for us as Canadians to have confidence in ourselves, to recognize the strengths our country has, to recognize that certainly we depend on the United States, but the United States also depends on us.
Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault says Alberta Premier Daniel Smith is being, quote, highly irresponsible. He says Smith's pledge to make greenhouse gas emissions data the property of the province could lead to oil and gas companies breaking federal laws if they stop reporting information. Smith's plan is one of a number of steps she says the UCP will take to challenge Ottawa's proposed emissions cap if it came into effect. Representatives with the oil and gas sectors say while they applaud Smith sticking up for them, they were not consulted before Premier Smith announced her plans. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew says he raised the issue of strengthening federal investment in the RCMP in his province during the recent meeting with the premiers. The leaders gathered to discuss massive new import tariffs threatened by Donald Trump. The incoming president says he will keep the tariffs in place until Canada and Mexico move to stem the flow of illegal migrants and drugs into the United States. Kinew says there is no downside into investing in law enforcement and cracking down on drug trafficking in Canada, especially at a time when that message might be well received south of the border.
Manitobans have long been talking about drugs being an issue in our communities. This is going back many years. And so what's the downside? If we invest in law enforcement and we crack down on drug trafficking here at a time when that message might be well received in the States, at the same time, we're going to make communities safer here in Manitoba.
A new study by Journal Research revealed the most dangerous Canadian provinces to work in based on the average of lost time claims to each province's labor force. According to the research, the most dangerous province in our country to work in is Quebec, which averaged 2,609 claims for every 100,000 workers. British Columbia is second with an average of 2,095 claims, and Manitoba came in third at 1,944. Here in Alberta, meanwhile, the province averages 1,432 claims per 100,000 workers, close to 1,200 less than Quebec. Saskatchewan took fifth spot with 1,393 claims on average. Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia round out 6 through number 8. Ontario sits in the second least amount of claims on average at 1,013 per 100,000, despite having the second most number of claims due to their high population. The study says that New Brunswick is the safest province in Canada in which to work, with 933 claims on average for every 100,000 workers. Now, in a released statement to Bridge City News, Alberta Jobs Minister Matt Jones says he took issue with the study and said that Alberta saw a decrease in injury and fatality rates on the job, even with an increased number in the provincial workforce. Close to 200 members of the Canadian Armed Forces are leaving Edmonton this week. They're headed to Latvia as part of an ongoing NATO mission that was extended because of the war in Ukraine. Officials say it will be part of a 6-month mission called Operation Reassurance. The mission began 10 years ago, and in 2022, Ottawa announced a multi-year renewal of the operation a year ahead of schedule due to the security situation in Eastern Europe. The members will be led by Lord Strathcona's Horse, which is Canada's only tank regiment. Those being deployed will bring the total of CAAF members in the region to about 2,000. The folks with the Weather Network say Canada is in for a colder and more traditional winter than last year. The network's chief meteorologist, Chris Scott, breaks down the seasonal forecast and says we better be prepared to bundle up.
It's a very different winter than what we had last year. Winter will at least attempt to salvage its reputation across Canada. Remember, a year ago, we went through an extremely mild winter. We had a strong El Nino in the Pacific Ocean. And that's important because the Pacific Ocean, I like to think of it as the engine that drives the global weather pattern. So when the Pacific is warm, it tends to overwhelm a lot of the weather across Canada. We tend to get warmer winters on average. That's what we saw last year. This year, it's completely different. El Nino is faded. Now, we have expected La Nina, its counterpart, which is a switching of where the warm water is in the Pacific, to come on, but it's even kind of stalled. La Nina's been afraid to walk through the door, so we're kind of stuck in neutral right now in the Pacific. And so that's one of the things we look at. We're also looking at other weather patterns and indices around the world. And all of this leads us to believe that we have a much more I hesitate to say typical because there's really no such thing as a typical winter, but there will be more impactful winter weather and cold weather across Canada this year than what we saw last year.
Well, here in Lethbridge, we experienced a chilly day and a lot of fog earlier today, but we saw some sunshine earlier as well. Jeanette Rocher is now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, it appears as though more clouds may be rolling in and the potential of bringing some flurries as well.
You know, we thought we were out of the woods with the snow, but it looks like we could see another 40% chance of flurries this evening. Tomorrow, much chillier as well, -14 for the daytime high. And of course, a risk of frostbite tomorrow when you add in that wind chill factor of -29 by tomorrow afternoon. I do have some good news though, because as we look to the temperatures next week, we're actually going to see a 14-degree day. And I do mean that with a plus mark. I'll be back later in the show to tell you all about that.
All right, thanks so much, Jeanette. After Lethbridge City Council received what they called a disturbing report regarding the mismanagement of funds for the Lethbridge and District exhibition, Council is now being recommended to increase property taxes. After a presentation was given to the city's Economic and Finance Committee, Council was recommended options to reduce the $17 million loan the LDE is facing, which will rise to $35 million with interest over the course of 30 years. If the city takes on the loan, refinancing options and grants are available, and the term could be reduced to 10 years, saving city taxpayers about $15 million. Closure of the facility next year is an option, but would cost $4.1 million, and officials say that would provide no community benefit compared to the same cost it would take to run the facility with economic benefits involved. City officials say we're looking at a property tax increase from the original 5.1% to 7.34%. As an example, that would be an increase of about $60 a year on a single-family home worth $327,000. City Council will further discuss these options at their next meeting on December the 10th. Lethbridge Police wrapped up a month-long project in which 26 people were arrested, along with 63 charges being laid. Police also seized more than $95,000 in drugs, including fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine. A number of weapons were also confiscated, including 6 firearms, knives, tasers, and even a crossbow. Now, in an email statement, Inspector Jason Doberstein from the Criminal Investigation Unit said, while the arrests and seizures most certainly disrupted the sale, flow, and consumption of drugs in our community, we know our efforts will be short-lived, and we are committed to continuing the deployment of resources to target the city's most prolific drug offenders. Alberta's municipal elections will take place on October 20th of 2025. Lethbridge City officials say some big changes will be taking place next year. Bonnie Hilford, elections returning officer and Lethbridge City Clerk, says the modifications are in connection with Bill 20. Hilford explains what the changes are and their impact will be in our city.
The first one is an electors registry, which is also what we know as a voters list. So that's a requirement. The next one is prohibiting tabulators, which we've used since 1992. So therefore, we'll be hand counting ballots instead of using tabulators, and therefore the results will be significantly delayed. We won't get them the Monday night of the election as we usually do. And then the last one is police checks with nomination papers that are filed by candidates, and that's optional for council to decide with the bylaw. We're anticipating over $300,000 for the Bill 20 impacts. The registry, we needed some software, and we need people to man the voting stations with regards to the registry, because you'll come in and there'll be a list, whether it's electronic or paper. At this time, we're not sure, but someone will have to stroke names off the list. If you're not on the list, there'll be forms that will have to be done in duplicate. So there's cost to that. Another change for the 2025 election is we will have probably, we're thinking 3 super stations for voting instead of the 14 smaller stations. We just find that we'd have some cost savings with that and in efficiencies as well.
You'll be voting for council and be voting for either public school or separate school. Typically, between those different categories, we'd have up to 65 candidates. So they all be listed on one ballot. You pick however many are appropriate. In addition, if there's any municipal questions, last time there's a questions on the bridge, there's also a question on the ward system. That again was all included on one ballot.
City officials say nominations will begin the first part of January. The Blood Tribe has a newly elected chief and council. General elections wrapped up on Wednesday. Now, 10 people were in the running to become chief, while 59 people were in the running for council. Traveler Plaited Hair is the projected winner to become the next Blood Tribe chief, securing just over 22% of the 3,446 votes, the highest percentage out of the candidates. 12 people will be joining council on top of the 4 incumbents, and the incumbents are Pinacoyam Buckskin Tailfeathers, Clarence Roy Blackwater, Dorothy Teresa First Rider, and Marcel Patrick Weaselhead. The polls took place in Lethbridge, Standoff, Moses Lake near Cardston, and in Calgary. A town in Ontario has been fined $10,000 and its mayor $5,000 after town officials refused to participate in Pride Month last June. Emo, a township located along the Minnesota border, has a population of around 1,300. The decision by the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario ruled that Emo, its mayor, and 2 of its councillors violated the Ontario Human Rights Code by refusing to proclaim June as Pride Month. The town also refused to fly the LGBTQ2+ rainbow flag. Now, the dispute began back in 2020 when a group called Borderland Pride approached the township proclaiming June as Pride Month. November is Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease, or COPD, Awareness Month. And according to Stats Canada, over 840,000 Canadians have been diagnosed with this condition. The Canadian Lung Association, however, predicts that there will be over 2 million people who have COPD, and half of the number have yet to be diagnosed. Henry Roberts, co-founder of the COPD Association of Canada, describes how to recognize the symptoms of this very serious condition.
Well, there's breathlessness, there's wheezing, there's the extreme increased mucus production. The people with chronic bronchitis, it's been described to me that they wake up in the morning and they're drowning in their own phlegm. Those are the primary symptoms of COPD. Oh, also fatigue. And you will discover what will happen is that you'll start to do activities that used to not wind you, and you'll suddenly become winded, whether that be going up the stairs, going for a brief walk. And a lot of people, particularly smokers, blame it on getting older and being out of shape, when in fact, it's their lungs. They've damaged their lungs, and they have to get to their doctor to undergo what's called a spirometry test.
Make sure you catch my full interview with Henry Roberts of the COPD Association of Canada coming up later in our program. You know, there are many thoughts when it comes to raising a child. Abe Block, retired pastor and now a great-grandfather, shares some seasoned advice on the importance of teaching children and how there are consequences for kids' actions.
Discipline needs to be in moderation, but it needs to be in relation to what the problem was. Not just some wild thing out there, but try and build it so that they learn there are consequences. Look at the world today. A lot of people haven't learned consequences, and we're living with a lot of difficulty and chaos in our world because there are consequences. As you grow up and get into your job, there are going to be discipline issues. You need to learn them when you're young and when it's not so hard.
Make sure you catch more parenting tips from retired pastor Abe Block coming up later in our program. The 98th annual Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade kicked off Thursday in New York City. It was met by a steady stream of rain. Thousands of ponchos and umbrellas were seen alongside a number of balloons and lots of wonderful floats, along with star-studded performances. In total, the event featured 22 big balloons and 34 incredible floats, including Spider-Man. Check that out. He's been working out. Officials say earlier in the day, pro-Palestinian protesters even blocked the street, but were cleared up by police. On Wednesday, New York Mayor Eric Adams warned against protesters disrupting the route. Well, it was a fairly chilly day today here in Lethbridge for a Thursday, and there's a chance of more of the white stuff developing fairly soon. Full weather details are coming up. Jeanette Rocher is now with a complete look at our weather picture. Jeanette, some beautiful hoarfrost behind you, shot by one of our video journalists, Landon Hickok. And we may also see a little bit of snow developing tonight, making the trees even whiter.
Even whiter, yes. But wasn't that hoarfrost just beautiful? I mean, even with the fog this morning, it just made it look so mystical, especially over the river valley there. But speaking of snowfall and whiter conditions, looking at another 40% chance of flurries overnight. And then tomorrow, colder, -14 for the high risk of frostbite, as we're going to see the wind chill factor at -28, -29. After that, -12 on Saturday. Now, I did say I had good news for you, and I do, because look at at the end of that 7-day forecast, especially Tuesday. So before we get there, we got to get through Sunday, which is high of -8, not too bad. Make that a +3 on Monday. And then there we go, that 14-degree day on Tuesday and then high of 10 on Wednesday. Well, that's more like it for this time of year, especially as we're getting very close to December as we get to the end of next week there. So average high for this time of year, 2 degrees, average low -10. 17 was our record high on this day back in 1908, and in 2006, Lethbridge saw its record cold day, which was -27. Sun rose this morning at 8:04 a.m. and we're looking at 8 hours and 31 minutes of daylight today, 2 minutes longer than we saw yesterday. Okay, Victoria, so let's take a look at this. Mix of sun and cloud earlier part of the day, and then 30% chance of showers, 7 for the high, 5 for the high in Vancouver tomorrow, with a 40% chance of showers. Edmonton, -17, 30% chance of flurries. Frost warning in effect there, frostbite warning, I should say, with wind chills more like around -29. Calgary sitting at -9 tomorrow with a mix of sun and cloud. Could see a little bit of flurry activity as well, about 30% there. Also seeing a risk of frostbite tomorrow in Saskatoon. Now the temperature sitting steady tomorrow at -30, but with the wind chill more like -39. That is cold. Now Regina, not only a frostbite warning in effect, but frostbite in minutes is what's expected there with a wind chill factor of -40, but daytime high of -29. And then Winnipeg sitting at -13 tomorrow with a 30% chance of flurries. As we look to the central part of the country, we are seeing more flurry activity as well. In fact, a 40% chance in Toronto, high of 2. That's more like it with those plus temperatures. 1 for the high in Ottawa with a 70% chance of flurries, and a 30% chance of flurries expected tomorrow in Montreal with a high of 4 degrees. Okay, lots of precipitation expected in the Maritimes tomorrow. We're seeing a significant snowfall warning in effect for New Brunswick tonight into Friday morning. We're seeing 15 to 20 centimeters of snow falling, and another 2 centimeters of snow tomorrow right in Fredericton there with a high of 5 degrees. Halifax, significant rainfall tonight, up to 20 millimeters, and then another 60% chance of showers tomorrow. Also 80K winds along parts of the coast tonight, and another 60K winds tomorrow, high of 8 degrees there in Halifax, 6 for the high in Charlottetown tomorrow. PEI actually seeing its first significant snowfall tonight. Could see 10 centimeters, and that's going to switch over to rain tomorrow. And then 10 millimeters of rain expected tomorrow in St. John's with a high of 7 degrees. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
The Canadian Federation of Independent Business is asking the federal government to credit at least $1,000 to small firms affected by the 2-month GST holiday. CFIB President Dan Kelly says the credit would cover costs to reprogram point-of-sale systems to remove and then reinstate the tax. The tax holiday is set to begin on December 14th and apply on a list of specific goods, including prepared foods at grocery stores, children's clothing, toys, and restaurant meals. Kelly says an online survey conducted by the Federation found a majority of small firms opposed the planned tax holiday. Representatives of Alberta's oil and gas industry say the provincial government did not consult with their sector before announcing plans to challenge the proposed federal greenhouse gas emissions cap. Tristan Goodman of the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada says oil and gas companies were unaware of Premier Daniel Smith's plan to announce a motion under the province's Sovereignty Act. Smith says the move will give Alberta the ability to assert ownership over its own fossil fuel resources. Goodman says companies need to see more detail about what Smith is proposing, including her suggestion that the province take exclusive control and ownership of emissions data collected at oil and gas sites. He also says while there are aspects of the plan that still need to be worked out, the industry is generally pleased that the province is taking strong action to defend our energy sector. Hyundai is recalling more than 250,000 SUVs and small cars in Canada and the United States because the rear-view camera image may not show up on the screens. The recall covers Santa Fe and Elantra vehicles from 2021 and 2022 model years. It affects more than 48,000 vehicles in Canada and 226,000 in the United States. Hyundai blames solder joints on a printed circuit board that can develop cracks. Dealers will replace the cameras at no cost to owners, who will be notified by mail beginning on January the 19th. As for the markets, they were closed today due to the American Thanksgiving holiday. But recapping one of our top stories, The union representing around 55,000 striking Canada Post workers says the Crown Corporation is using a scare tactic by temporarily laying some of them off during the walkout. The company told employees that the collective agreements are no longer in effect and their conditions of employment have been changed. You know, many of us have heard of COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Is there a cure or best practices in helping someone with this chronic condition? Henry Roberts, the co-founder of the COPD Association of Canada, will offer up his thoughts in just a few moments. Listen, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews. You know, no one likes being short of breath. Imagine being short of breath as part of your daily life, your daily routine. That's too often the case for those who struggle with COPD. Henry Roberts is our guest today. He joins us now from Toronto, and he's the co-founder of the Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease Association of Canada. Henry, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, how would you best describe COPD, Henry?
Okay, well, COPD is an acronym that stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Within that broader definition, there are three categories of condition. One is chronic bronchitis, the second is emphysema, and the third is alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. I'll just review those. In chronic bronchitis, the airways become inflamed and narrowed. And this leads to increased production of mucus, causing a persistent cough and difficulty in breathing. In emphysema, it involves the destruction of the air sacs, the alveoli in the lungs, which results in a reduction of the surface area for oxygen exchange. People with emphysema experience shortness of breath, reduced lung function, and extreme bouts of breathlessness. Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, this is a genetic disorder that people are born with a problem with a protein called the alpha-1 antitrypsin protein. And this makes them very susceptible to catching COPD. And they often catch alpha-1 emphysema. Those people, it's only about 5 or 10% of the population of COPDers, but they have to be extremely careful not to expose themselves to secondhand smoke or the dusty environment. So those are the three categories of COPD.
So Henry, how many people are affected by this condition here in Canada?
Well, according to Statistics Canada, more than 840,000 people have been diagnosed with COPD and are living with the challenges. The Canadian Lung Association estimates that there are upward of 2 million people who have COPD, and about half have not been diagnosed and are unaware that they have the condition.
You know, some of my family members who used to smoke, they suffer from COPD now. But what are some of the other causes of COPD, and is it really preventable?
Well, it is preventable. The easiest way to prevent COPD is never to smoke cigarettes. And now we're dealing with vaping as well. So you have to keep away from those things. Cigarette smoking is the largest cause of COPD. Considering the forest fires that have been happening out west, it's very well down east as well. It's very important to protect yourself from inhaling those airborne particulates. And if you're working in an environment that, let's say, a welder, you've got to really be careful as to how much you're inhaling. There's some very good medicines that if you do catch COPD, that can alleviate the symptoms.
So for those who suspect that they may have COPD, Henry, what are some of the symptoms then?
Well, there's breathlessness, there's wheezing, there's the extreme increased mucus production. The people with chronic bronchitis, it's been described to me that they wake up in the morning and they're drowning in their own phlegm. Those are the primary symptoms of COPD. Oh, also fatigue. And you will discover what will happen is that you'll start to do activities that used to not wind you, and you'll suddenly become winded, whether that be going up the stairs, going for a brief walk. And a lot of people, particularly smokers, blame it on getting older and being out of shape, when in fact, it's their lungs. They've damaged their lungs, and they have to get to their doctor to undergo what's called a spirometry test, which measures your lung function.
So is there any way to really reverse COPD then?
No, it's a chronic disease and you're just going to get worse. They can alleviate the symptoms. As I mentioned, there are very good medicines that are available out there, and most of them are covered on the provincial formularies.
You touch base on one of the tests. Are there other tests available to really check if we have COPD?
Yeah, there are a variety of lung function tests that the doctor will walk you through. The primary one, however, is the spirometry test, and that's the one with World COPD Day, the occasion of World COPD Day. We're really pushing people to go and get a spirometry test if they suspect that they might have COPD.
When my son was younger, he battled asthma and he used one of his inhalers, which helped him to breathe. Would you consider something like that very similar for somebody struggling with COPD to help them breathe easier too?
Yeah, totally. Once you've been diagnosed by spirometry, which measures how forcefully you can exhale in 1 second, and that's compared to normal people of the same age, sex, and height. The COPD is measured in stages. So at stage one, your forced expiratory volume is about 80% of what a normal person like you would normally exhale. And you go through these, so you will get worse over time. And as you get worse over time, your spirometry volume drops and your stage of COPD increases. So it's kind of an inverse relationship. So when you're at stage 4 COPD, your spirometry, your ability to exhale is about 20 less than 30% of a normal person's ability to exhale. Now, based on your stages, the doctors will prescribe different kinds of medicines. So they usually start you on a bronchodilator, a LAMA or a LABA, and these open up your airways. As you get worse and worse over time, they will add a corticosteroid. So you'd be taking, with brand names, would be like a Spiriva and an Advair, or a Spiriva and Symbicort. Those are two combinations. In the last few years, the drug industry has developed triple therapy. So it's basically what I just described in one puffer. And there are two on the market now. One's called Breztri and the other is called Trelegy. And what's coming down the pipe are new biologics, which further enhance the ability of these medicines to reduce inflammation, which is the big issue here. It's the same in asthma.
So Henry, does diet and exercise really play much of a role in managing COPD?
Diet and exercise will, if you're able to, if people have access to pulmonary rehab facilities in their area, we highly recommend that they get into those classes, because they will teach you how to rebreathe. As we get older, we tend to become shallow breathers. We're breathing off the top of the chest, as opposed to when we were young. If you look at a little baby, you watch their belly go up and down as they breathe. They're really using their diaphragm to breathe. And the pulmonary rehab will reteach you how to breathe from the diaphragm. They'll also teach you how to exercise your lung muscles. They will push the need to be active, to go out for your daily walk if the weather permits, and also to moderate your diet, because obviously if you're obese, that affects your ability to breathe.
Now, when it comes to drug coverage here in our country in Canada, is it fairly consistent in helping those who are struggling with COPD?
It's not consistent at all. In Alberta, where you are, the coverage is actually pretty good. In the East Coast, it's terrible. And Ontario, we're kind of in the middle range now. I mentioned these new biologics that are coming. They have not been approved for coverage. And in our case, for the Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease Association, most of our members are over 65. Our membership ranges from 65 to 90. So it's pretty imperative that the medicines that I've mentioned and the new ones coming are covered on the provincial drug plans. It's a financial imperative for our members in particular.
Henry, let's talk a little bit about some of the unmet needs in COPD. What are they?
Well, one of the big unmet need is access to pulmonary rehab. And I have been insistent that people get a spirometry test, but the availability of spirometry testing, again, is really spotty across the country. I was in a meeting the other day with a respirologist from Quebec up in the Gatineau area, and she's unable to get spirometry testing. Even for her patients with COPD, it's just not available. The other issue with the testing is that it should ideally be available in a doctor's office and if you're in a medical clinic for sure, but that too is not happening. There's one doctor in London, Ontario, Chris Lexley, who's pushing that every clinic of any size have a respiratory educator, a respiratory therapist on staff so that the GP with suspecting COPD can send the patient to the respiratory therapist who is trained on giving spirometry tests and interpreting the results. So there's a real lack of access and lack of capability. And I think many of the provincial governments haven't even figured out what the pay scale should be for a doctor who spends the time giving the test. So there's a lot of work that has to be done.
So Henry, those patients who are in the latter stages of COPD, are they actually, or maybe even in the middle stages, are they on waiting lists for maybe lung transplants?
Well, they could be. It's really quite a process to get on the list for a lung transplant. If we use Toronto General Hospital as an example, a number of our members have had double lung transplants there. So there's quite an interviewing process to begin with, and the doctors are really looking to make sure that you've got the stamina and the will to go through what you're going to go through. They don't want to be giving lungs to people who aren't going to take the medicines, who aren't going to go to rehab to the exercise classes. So they're not stingy with access, but they want to make sure that the people who receive the lungs are worthy, basically, are worthy of receiving the lungs. And then you also have to go for testing at the facility. The case I'm referring to is Toronto General, and that happens, I think, over a course of about a month, and then you get on the waiting list.
Now, are there support groups available to encourage people along their journey who are battling COPD?
Yes, there are. There's our group, there's the Lung Association, all of them across the country, as well as the Canadian Lung Association. There's a group called Respi Plus, and their program is called Living Well with COPD. So you go livingwellwithcopd.com, and they have a series of extremely good educational modules that will walk you through the process. As do the different lung associations. And the Ontario Lung Association a couple of years ago recast itself as the Lung Health Foundation. They're national now, and they have some very good programs, and they have very good support. So they have helplines and the things of that nature.
And any final advice for those with COPD or those who think they may actually have it?
Well, if they're smokers, they should quit smoking right away. And not to consider, vaping ever. There are a lot of medicines they can take to help them quit smoking, but that is the number one thing that they can do for themselves is to quit smoking.
Henry Roberts is the co-founder of the Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease Association of Canada. Henry, thanks so much for joining us today from Toronto.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Al. Nice to meet you.
I think it's safe to say that parenting has always been a challenge. We learn from our successes and our failures. Books, training courses, and those with parenting experience also really helps along the way. Today we're joined by Abe Block, who's a parent, grandparent, and now even a great-grandparent, and a retired pastor here in Lethbridge. He has some parenting tips for us. Welcome back to Bridge City News, Abe.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and it's good to be with all the listeners that are tuning in.
Absolutely, and the viewers too. Now, one thing that
Yes.
probably hasn't changed over the years, Abe, is that siblings tend to have conflicts as they grow up together. You know, brothers and sisters, various disagreements and arguments. Do you have any advice on how to reduce the frequency of this to get your kids to maybe learn to disagree with each other and still love each other?
That's a major issue. Back in my day, and of course that was a while ago, you'll understand, things were a little different. You did mention that today things have changed. They've changed dramatically, but I think one of the biggest issues, Hal, is the lack of communication. I look at the world today and I understand the young people watching the world today, and what do they see? They see a lot of disagreement. They see a lot of arguing. They see a lack of communication in our society, in our governments relating to people and to us, wars and rumors of wars. And you look at Haiti in the world today, if you're following that at all, I mean, it's absolute chaos. And you say to yourself, this is what our children are seeing. Is it any surprise that they think the natural thing is to disagree and to argue? The other issue could be that if you don't agree with me, you can't be my friend. And so I think that's one of the key issues. And so we as parents, we need to set up a time. The Bible says, train up a child in the way that it should go. And when it is old, it will remember and learn and be. How do we train? The other thing that reminds me is that in our world as well, we have husband and wife working so much out of the home. So where do we find time to train and to teach? With my children, I set up what I call the Yes But Conference every so often, where we would sit down. Every child could speak what their issues were, what they liked, what they didn't like, and no one could respond negatively. Each one got a chance, and that meant that we as parents were listening. We heard them. And then we also had opportunity to train and respond. I think that's one of the biggest things. If we can't train, how are they going to learn? And we live in chaos.
Yeah, communication is key, absolutely, for siblings and then parents to their kids. Now, how about forgiveness and apologies, Abe? How important are they as we develop a stronger relationship with our kids and grandkids?
I think that's a great thing. Apologies and forgiveness work together. And it depends on what is an apology. You see, so often in our world, we simply hear, well, I'm sorry. And what kind of a response? Oh, don't even think about it. Well, that's not dealing with anything. If I'm going to apologize, I need to apologize to the issue. What was the issue? That's what I'm apologizing for, and it needs to be from the heart. And then the response needs to be a response to the issue. Never say, oh, it was nothing. What needs to be said is, yes, you hurt me, and I thank you for the apology, and I really want to forgive you. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be reconciliation. When the apology is correct and the response is to the issue, you're opening the door for reconciliation. And I think that's one of the keys in all of this. I think back to what our government is trying to do with truth and reconciliation with our Aboriginal people. Okay, where's the truth and what's the reconciliation? Have we ever spelled it out? And so if you don't spell these things out to each other, it's just, I'm sorry, don't worry about it. That doesn't go anywhere in my books.
Abe, let's talk about discipline for just a moment here. I know when my son was younger, he hated the fact we put him in the corner, standing all alone in the corner, you know, to show some discipline, but he'd appreciate it afterwards, and he would apologize, and we would clear the air about certain things, maybe if there's a misunderstanding as well. How important is discipline and maybe setting up that structure for our kids today?
I think discipline is increasingly important. In our world, if there's not going to be that kind of a setup, the world isn't going to cater to you. For example, I see a lot of parents in the modern world saying to their 2-year-old child, what do you want for breakfast? Day after day, what do you want for lunch, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that child is way too young to make those decisions.
Chocolate. I want chocolate. Give me chocolate.
I want chocolate.
And ice cream, right?
That's not going to be the world they get into at all. And so I think discipline needs to be in moderation, but it needs to be in relation to what the problem was. not just some wild thing out there, but try and build it so that they learn there are consequences. Look at the world today. A lot of people haven't learned consequences, and we're living with a lot of difficulty and chaos in our world because there are consequences. As you grow up and get into your job, there are going to be discipline issues. You need to learn them when you're young and when it's not so hard.
Let's circle back to structure for just a moment here, Abe. How important is it to really set up the boundaries for our kids?
Well, I think that's the key issue. If the kids raised without any boundaries when they're young, they're not going to expect any boundaries when they go and work in an organization, and there are going to be boundaries, and they've never learned that. So how are they going to deal with boundaries when they've got a job if they've never learned it when they're young? We need to teach when they're younger so that they learn it and walk into life and walk into occupations and walk into situations with people where they need to learn to listen. And I think a lot of our young people do want boundaries. I remember the one dad talking to me, and his daughter was invited by the school to an issue where she knew she probably shouldn't go. And so she said to her dad, "Dad, will you please tell me I can't go? That way I save face when I face my kids, and you can take the blame, but you're not in the picture." I think that works.
Now, what's the balance between setting healthy boundaries, Abe, and on the flip side, giving your kids and maybe your teenagers some freedom?
I think the freedom comes when they learn where the freedom is within boundaries. For example, for the younger children, give them space, but set the boundaries. For example, I know some girls, when they start school, they already want to dress the way they want to dress. And so I would suggest to the mother, pick up what you think are reasonable ones, but give them an option about 3 or 4. But don't give them an option of the whole expanse of what they have, because that's not suitable. So let them make choices within boundaries so that they learn, okay, I can make a choice, but there are boundaries, because in life, that's how it's going to be. I'm going to have boundaries, but I'm also going to be able to learn how to make choices. Like with finances, give them small finances at the beginning so they can learn to be responsible and accountable, but within the boundaries of whatever their finances are.
Now let's talk about, we mentioned the boundaries, but how about when your kids disagree with you when it comes to set boundaries? You know, I used to ask my father, well, why can't I do this? He said, because I said so. That was always his reasoning behind it, right? Well, no, kids need more than that. So how do we nurture that relationship and create a positive, healthy relationship when we're setting those boundaries?
Well, I can think of an example in my own life. My one daughter didn't have her driver's license yet, and she worked at a record shop, and the guy had a beautiful souped up, well, not a souped up car, but a very nice car, but he wanted to sell it. And she looked at that car and she wanted to buy it all the best way. So what can I do but say no? No, I didn't say no. I sat down with her. I said, okay, how can we work this out? Because you can't even drive it. If you're going to buy it, it's going to sit on the yard and just whatever. So I happened to have a friend who taught mechanics in the school, and he needed vehicles to teach mechanics to the kids. So I said to my daughter, go ahead and buy the thing. Let's talk to this guy, see if he'll take the car, use it for a whole year in the school. You'll get a car that's fixed up by the time you can drive it. That way you can get it, but there are boundaries set up and you're going to have to wait for it. I think if we can set up things like that with our kids to make them feel positive and yet within some kind of control factors, I think that might work.
You know, it's funny, when I was 16, I bought my first car, an old Datsun. I had just enough money, $1,000 to buy it, but it was a manual transmission, so I had to learn how to shift the manual transmission. And then I had to save up more money to insure it and register to put it on the road. So that took another 3-4 months. So
exactly, but that's a good plan. That works.
Yeah, it was a lesson, a life lesson, absolutely. So Abe, how important is it for parents to maybe play some games or activities with their kids to help maybe draw them a little closer for bonding, like bonding time with our children?
We talked about communications before. What better way to communicate with your kids than either play games with them or to do sports with them. It opens the door to conversation, and communication is the best thing. And especially if you're catering to some of their desires, even if you're not an athlete or anything, but you can support, you can be there, et cetera, et cetera. I think I've done a lot of counseling, and I asked this one couple once, what do you remember most about your parents? And the one person said, my dad was at every game I ever played. But the other person said, my dad loved me more than I could ever imagine. You know, those are two opposites, but they're both beautiful, and they bring in communication. I think we have forgotten the idea of communicating and then still disagreeing, but communicating and loving each other anyway. We don't have to think the same, but we need to be on the same page in the final end.
You know what I've noticed as a parent myself as well of two kids, my son and my daughter, is praising them, especially with their successes and helping them through their failures as well. What did we learn? Like a life lesson that's learned here. Abe, another big part of parenting is the process of passing our faith onto our children. How can we do this most effectively?
Well, we need to find time, first of all. I mean, like I said before, with all parents doing so much working outside of the home, and I'm not decrying that. It's a necessity in our world, I think. But it seems like that takes away time. And putting your faith in an encouraging way with your children is going to take time. And part of that time, I, for example, like to have devotions once a day. My dad had devotions every supper time. We always took 15, 20 minutes for him to teach us his faith. And then he have a question and answer period after we had eaten, if we had any questions about it. The other thing is, can we take them either to home groups or to Bible study groups or to church or to places like that? And that refers me back to how communicative is my church to everybody and including youth? Do I have people in the church that can communicate and relate to the young people and build their faith? But it's got to start at home. We cannot depend on the church to do it all. We are responsible to begin that process when they're young. And then we encourage them as they mature to find it in other places as well.
And very important to live our faith as well. Abe, I think most of us as children when we were younger had some insecurity issues. What child didn't? Any thoughts on the importance of hugging and loving our children, like the physical touch and communicating that love to our children?
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy. I'm a hugger, and I love to hug, but I have to be very careful. In our modern world, that's not accepted by everybody. It's not even accepted by society in many ways. We have become very individualistic. And so I have had to become very sensitive to how people feel about being hugged and about touching. I remember, especially during COVID, now this was during COVID, but out in New Brunswick, there was a kindergarten boy who hugged one of the kindergarten girls, and they took him to court. Now that's really extreme, but they did take him to court because he wasn't supposed to hug anybody. But you know, we are missing the personal touch. That is so encouraging. And if we can just live with it without reacting, I think it's a very positive thing. I think touch is crucial. The Bible tells us, what did Jesus do? He took the little children and he put them on his lap. And I'm thinking he hugged them. Suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. We have gotten to the stage of a little bit too much forbidding. I think the encouragement needs to be there.
You know, you're right. The human interaction is vital to healthy relationships, whatever
Yes.
they are. Now, it seems we're getting busier and busier these days, Abe, with scattered schedules for parents, many different family members always on the road. How important is it to sit down during family time and have meals together?
I think that's a key. In my family, when I grew up, we always had at least one meal together. The supper meal, we were together. Nowadays, with the kids scattering all over the place, the parents taking them here and there, find one meal where you can be together. Even at the beginning of the day, that's not possible anymore. Some dads are leaving at 6 o'clock in the morning and the kids aren't even out of bed yet, getting ready for school. There needs to be a place. It doesn't have to be around a meal. I like the meal idea because that's open discussion. That's where everybody's just relaxed and they're eating and they're joking, and it's a good place for interaction and for discussion and for questions. But nowadays, it's hard to sit down to a meal together with even the kids going all over the place. But my idea is somewhere, find a time in the day, and if it's not every day, find a time somewhere during the week, a couple of times, to sit together as a family. That's relationships. That's necessary in many areas of our lives.
Let's sit down and break bread together. Abe Block is a retired Lethbridge pastor. He's also a grandfather, great-grandfather, and of course a father. Thanks so much for some of the great parenting advice today, Abe.
My joy. God bless.
You as well. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks for watching.